Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something truly fascinating. We're going to look at how modern scholars actually use secular historical methodology to examine an ancient miracle claim. Specifically, we're exploring the historical bedrock of resurrection, looking through the lens of a highly rigorous framework known as the minimal facts method. It's a pretty incredible journey through historiography, so let's just jump right in. So let's start with a massive question. Can a miracle actually be proven using standard history? Usually when we think of miracles, we immediately think of theology, right? Or maybe blind faith. But today's source material completely bypasses religious dogma. Instead, it evaluates a huge historical event through verifiable data and strict historiography. We're literally going to look at the evidence the exact same way a classicist or an ancient historian would. Here is our investigative roadmap for today. We'll start with the problem of history, define our historical bedrock, lay out the 6 minimal facts, test the alternative theories, and finish up with the cosmic climax. All right, part 1, the problem of history, or the epistemological crisis. You see, when scholars approach history, they often get stuck between two massive extremes. On one side, you have this rigid view, post-Enlightenment positivism, which excludes any divine agency right out of the gate. Before even looking at the evidence, it basically just says, nope, miracles are impossible. On the other side is radical postmodern skepticism. This extreme claims by historical objectivity itself is totally impossible, arguing that ancient texts are just subjective ideologies, meaning we can't really know anything objective about the past at all. So both of these extremes essentially block the investigation before it even starts. To get past that massive roadblock, historians use a really viable middle ground lens called critical realism. Basically, it acknowledges, hey, yes, our access to antiquity isn't perfect. However, by using methodical neutrality and completely transparent criteria, we can still yield highly reliable historical knowledge. We don't assume the ancient texts are innocent, and we don't assume they're guilty. We simply let the transparent evidence do the talking. Moving on to part 2. Defining historical bedrock through the minimal facts method. To establish this bedrock, scholar Gary Habermas spent decades refining a brilliant methodology. He contrasts two main approaches. The first is top-down apologetics, which acts kind of like a prefabricated roof. It requires you to prove that the entire ancient text is completely inerrant. But think about it. If a critic questions just one minor detail, say a chronological timeline, that whole roof collapses. Habermas instead proposes the minimal facts method. This is a brick wall method. It builds from the bottom up using independent, isolated facts. If someone disputes a peripheral detail, it doesn't matter because each individual brick of historical evidence remains totally indestructible and intact. And this brings us to a really cool concept called the Iliad Principle. Think about how historians treat Homer's Iliad. They obviously don't think it's a divinely inspired book, but they still extract genuine historical facts from it, like the actual existence of Troy, using standard historical criteria. The minimal facts method does the exact same thing here. It sets aside any assumptions of biblical inspiration and treats the texts as ordinary ancient Greek documents. By demanding localized, specific evidence, scholars can extract undeniable historical truths and avoid traps, like the easily faked healing miracles claimed by the Roman Emperor Vespasian. All right, part 3, the 6 minimal facts. These are our indestructible bricks. Now, what exactly makes a fact minimal? It's not about providing the least amount of information. It's about facts that pass 2 incredibly rigorous tests. First is the evidential criterion. This is the primary test. The fact absolutely must be established by abundant, strong, multi-sourced historical evidence. Second is the consensus criterion. The fact must be conceded by a vast majority of published specialists across the entire spectrum. We are talking about everyone here, from atheists and agnostics to liberal Protestants and conservative evangelicals. These facts aren't just accepted by believers, they are conceded by critical scholars across the board, because the evidence is just that compelling. So let's walk through these 6 indestructible bricks that make up our historical wall. Brick 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, a medically lethal execution. Brick 2, shortly after, his disciples experienced visual encounters they were completely convinced were post-mortem sightings. Brick 3, these disciples were radically transformed from cowards into bold proclaimers literally willing to die for this specific claim. Brick 4. This message was proclaimed incredibly early in Jerusalem, the exact city where he was buried. Brick 5. James, the brother of Jesus and a known hardened skeptic, suddenly converted. And finally, brick 6. Saul of Tarsus, an enemy who was actively persecuting the church, was suddenly converted into the Apostle Paul. To really grasp the breadth of this consensus, just look at Bart D. Ehrman. He's an atheist New Testament scholar. He plainly states that the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is the most certain element of the tradition, independently attested in a wide array of sources. I mean, when atheist historians and conservative scholars are nodding in agreement, you absolutely know you've hit historical bedrock. Next, we introduce what's called the +1 strategy, the empty tomb. Habermas cleverly insulates the core argument by keeping this as a highly evidenced but second-order fact. The empty tomb actually has formidable backing, like the fact that early enemies didn't deny it was empty, they just claimed the body was stolen. But by treating it as a +1 fact, even if a skeptic completely rejects the empty tomb, those core 6 minimal facts we just talked about remain completely intact.
Which brings us to part 4, testing the alternatives to find the best explanation.
To evaluate all this data, historians use a strict academic rubric designed by philosopher Behan McCullagh. It's called the Argument to the Best Explanation, or ABE. Any theory we test must have explanatory scope, meaning it accounts for a large quantity of facts. It needs explanatory power, explaining those facts without forcing or straining the data. It has to have plausibility within the historical context. It needs to be less ad hoc, which basically means it requires fewer unevidenced assumptions. And finally, it must offer illumination to other historical mysteries. Let's run the naturalistic theories through this gauntlet. First up, the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus just passed out on the cross. Well, this completely fails explanatory scope because it denies minimal facts number 1, lethal crucifixion. Furthermore, a severely wounded, half-dead man limping out of a tomb wouldn't plausibly inspire a massive victory movement. Next is the fraud theory, suggesting the disciples just stole the body. This totally fails to explain why an enemy like Paul or a skeptic like James would ever convert, and it fails plausibility because martyrs simply do not willingly endure torture for a hoax they invented themselves. Finally, the hallucination theory. This fails because hallucinations are individual, subjective events. They cannot explain multiple group sightings. It also requires massive, unevidenced psychological coincidences across different people who weren't even grieving, like Paul. So the crucial point here is that when evaluated strictly by standard historiographical criteria, the source argues that the resurrection hypothesis cleanly explains all the facts. It has the greatest explanatory scope and power, and relies on a single, less ad hoc premise, that God acted in history. For scholars using this method, it actually emerges as the superior historical inference. Finally, part 5, the cosmic climax and redemptive history. Because you see, this historical bedrock doesn't just establish some random isolated miracle. According to theologian Walter C. Kaiser Jr., it anchors what's called a promise plan theology. This is a continuously unfolding divine plan running straight through biblical history, from the very first promises in Genesis, through the election of Abraham, the dwelling at Sinai, and the covenant with David. The resurrection is the historically verified messianic climax that proves this massive, progressive redemptive plan wasn't just a myth, but a reality grounded in our physical universe. And this fits perfectly into the broader context of the first century. Scholar Michael S. Heiser highlights the ancient divine council worldview. To the ancient Hebraic mind, this space-time event wasn't just about personal salvation, it was viewed as a cosmic climax. It was Yahweh's decisive victory over ancient, rebellious spiritual powers, reversing the ancient rebellions of Eden and Babel and officially reclaiming the disinherited nations. The historical bedrock literally anchors a cosmic reclamation project. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to ponder. If strict historical bedrock verifies the space-time reality of the resurrection, how does that fundamentally change our understanding of ancient cosmic history? If the minimal facts hold up and the academic consensus says they absolutely do, it changes everything about how we view the ancient world. Thank you so much for joining me for this rigorous historical explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to dig into the evidence for yourself.